I'm Liz Cohen. I'm dean here at the Radcliffe Institute, and I am delighted to welcome all of you this afternoon to a lecture by Jane Kamensky, who is a professor of history here at Harvard, and the Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Foundation Director of the Schlesinger Library. Members of the Pforzheimer family have been steadfast supporters of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and all of Harvard. And I'm delighted that we have Gary and Mary Pforzheimer here with us today in the audience. So thank you. In fact, there are many supporters of the library and actually the entire Radcliffe Institute with us today. I appreciate the generosity of everyone, which makes all that we do here at Radcliffe possible. And I'm especially pleased to welcome members of both of Radcliffe's advisory councils, our Dean's Advisory Council and the Schlesinger Library Council. And I am so glad that you could all be with us today. Radcliffe is dedicated to inquiry and research that takes place beyond the curriculum and across the boundaries of academic disciplines. We bring together scholars and scientists, artists, and public intellectuals from around the world to share their work with each other and with a broad, interested public like you. Today, we are here to look at a very different time from an unconventional angle. And we could have no better guide than Jane Kamensky, my fellow historian and Radcliffe colleague. Jane earned her BA and her PhD at Yale University. She taught in the history department at Brandeis for 21 years, including doing 2 stints as department chair, and she survived. She also served as the core faculty on the core faculty in women's gender and sexuality studies at Brandeis while she was there. During the 2014-15 academic year, Jane was the Mary L. Corneal Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Newhouse Center for the Humanities at Wellesley College. In 2015, Jane came to Harvard to serve as the faculty director of Radcliffe's Schlesinger Library and as a member of the history department. But Jane's connections to Radcliffe go back even further. We are pleased that Jane was a Radcliffe Fellow in 2006-07 and a Bunting Fellow a decade before that. All of Jane's work, from her scholarship to her teaching to her leadership of the Schlesinger Library, is marked by innovation, dynamism, and creativity. These were the qualities that greatly inspired us when Jane interviewed for the position of faculty director. And in her first year and a half on the job, she has brought them to bear on her ambitious vision for the library. Together with Executive Director Marilyn Dunn, Jane has undertaken impressive efforts to diversify the library's collections, seeking to represent a fuller spectrum of women's experiences across class, race, political perspective, sexual orientation, religious experience, and more. And under her leadership, with the help of the Schlesinger's very able staff, the library is fast establishing itself as a pioneer in new ways of using rich manuscript archives in teaching and learning. No surprise that it is increasingly being sought out by professors from across Harvard schools and departments. Jane's innovation, dynamism, and creativity have likewise established her as a leading historian of early America and an interdisciplinary scholar who has written on colonial history, the history of women, gender, and the family, and the history of capitalism. She has also ranged beyond the conventional by co-authoring an historical novel and co-founding a digital journal called Commonplace, the Interactive Journal of Early American Life, and these are both projects that she did in partnership with fellow Harvard historian Jill Lepore. Interdisciplinary creativity marks all of Jane's books, along with her tireless research, her eye for just the right detail, and her elegant writer's voice, which combines analytical sophistication with a dash of playfulness. In her first book, entitled Governing the Tongue, The Politics of Speech in Early New England, Jane applied insights from anthropology and linguistics to examine speech as a way of wielding power in early America. For Jane's 2008 book, The Exchange Artist, She drew on urban design, architecture, and economics to tell the story of the Boston Coffee House, at one time an important Boston institution unique to its time and place in the early Republic. Jane probes this fascinating local site, and at the same time, she reveals its key role in the speculative capitalism of the early American Republic. In 2007, Jane received a prestigious New Directions grant from the Mellon Foundation, which allowed her to train in a totally new field to expand her methodological toolkit. Jane used the grant to spend a year in London immersing herself in the study of art history. That retooling contributed to Jane's latest book, A Revolution in Color, The World of John Singleton Copley, published last October. This book delves into the artistic life and the tumultuous times of a man best known for portraits of prominent figures like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams in a political revolution about which Copley himself remained ambivalent. True to Jane's commitment to at the Schlesinger to embed considerations of gender and family in how we tell all of our history, her Copley story locates him as much in the private life of his family and household as in the public life of 18th century imperial politics. If Copley was awash in ambivalence about the American Revolution, there has been nothing ambivalent about the critical response to A Revolution in Color. It has won the American History Book Prize of the New York Historical Society and the Annabel Jenkins Biography Prize of the American Society for 18th Century Studies. It was also named a finalist for Penn's Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for Biography, the Marfield Prize for Arts Writing, and the George Washington Book Prize. I am confident that we will all benefit from and greatly enjoy learning more about A Revolution in Color from Jane today. So now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jane Kamensky.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, Liz. I feel like there's nothing anybody now does not know about me. But if anybody wants to hear about the Hazel Avenue School in West Orange, New Jersey, we started after that. I'll tell you during the Q&A. Thank you also to Allison Franklin and her colleagues in communications who designed this wonderful image that you see behind me and did the work of getting everybody here today. Jess Briley, who does these images for Radcliffe, really is an artist in her own right. I think Copley would very much approve of her crop there. Thank you to my many Harvard colleagues who I see in the audience who have contributed in various ways, not just from the history department, but from around the campus, and from the museums and the libraries as well, in various ways to the final stages of this book, which took place after I had come to Harvard. And then last and most, to my colleagues from the Schlesinger Library, who make it an absolute joy to go to work every day, and who have made this book in ways that I couldn't have predicted and that they couldn't have predicted, in part a story about collecting. And you'll hear a little bit about that and I think sense a little bit of Schlesinger's impact on A Revolution in Color and my understanding of Copley's life towards the end. So my talk this afternoon is A Circle, which is a self-conscious choice about a way to tell a revolutionary story. After the American Revolution, and especially after the French Revolution a decade later, the word revolution took on a new meaning, which is neatly captured by Hannah Arendt in this quotation from her book on revolutions. Revolutions, she says, confront us directly and inevitably with problems of beginning. For revolutions, however we may be tempted to define them, are not mere changes, but entail, starting with a new beginning, a complete change of society. Americans in the time of the American Revolution adopted elements of this definition. The American Revolution came to be called the American Revolution as early as 1776, although not frequently until a generation later. Jefferson captures this Arendtian sense in a famous letter that he wrote upon his inaugural in 1801, which he called, of course, a second American Revolution, where he said in a letter to Joseph Priestley, "We can no longer say that there is nothing new under the sun, for this whole chapter in the history of man is new." Jefferson was very modest. My talk is a circle beginning and ending with this picture because Copley, like so many of his generation on both sides of the Atlantic, hewed to an older sense of what revolution meant, a circular sense based in Enlightenment science and in the agricultural calendar that centered on revolving, not always revolving to exactly the same place, but revolution as a putting right, more or less within a fixed orbit. Copley embraced in his work and in his life a certain degree of innovation, but not wholesale invention. He believed, though he didn't quite put it this way, in evolution rather than revolution. So this is Copley's grand picture of his own family, painted during the Revolutionary year of 1776. It's what was on his easel that spring. A diarist noted seeing it in his painting rooms in April, unfinished, with the likenesses just coming into focus, which means it takes only a little bit of poetic license, which I hope you will grant me, to place it there on the 4th of July. It was the largest and most complex picture Copley had ever painted at that time. It's about 10 times the size of his bust-length portraits, of which we're so fond in the Museum of Fine Arts. And it contains within it what we might say is his whole affective world. His beloved wife, Susanna, called Suki there, her little silk shod foot perched on a tuffet in a pose taken from Correggio's Madonna of St. Jerome, which Copley had just copied over a period of months in Parma, Italy. His stern-faced father-in-law, Richard Clark, who made everything about the picture and about Copley's life from this point forward at once both possible and inevitable. The artist shows himself behind as the master planner, and in ways you can't quite see in the resolution of a reproduction, just hugely fashionable in a beautiful bottle green velvet cloak, and he has a trail of his natural hair in a long queue romantically going down his back. And then 4 children portrayed in this newly playful, gambling fashion of the time, though by the time Copley painted the picture, one of them was dead, an ocean away, and never having been seen by his father. The glimpse of countryside in the background is vaguely Italianate. It closely approximates the biblical scene, the biblical backdrop to his painting, The Ascension, which was done the year before in 1775 in Rome, in a kind of mystical communion between Copley and Raphael's Transfiguration. He wrote a lot about this, and also with the palette of Poussin, which is everywhere in the way that the colors deploy themselves on the canvas. But if the setting, the natural setting in the backdrop of the family picture is Italian, the setting of the painting was London. So when I say that the painting was on Copley's easel on or about July 4th of 1776, that easel was set up in elegant rented quarters at 12 Leicester Square, just around the corner from the studio of Sir Joshua Reynolds and near the British Museum, so the respectable West End, not the West End of the actors and the whores. All spring long in 1776, people came in and out of Copley's new home, talking about the great public topic of the day, the American War, debating pamphlets for and against. On the day that the diarist Samuel Kirwan stopped by and saw the family portrait on the easel, he carried with him a new pamphlet entitled An Enquiry Whether the Guilt of the Present Civil War in America Ought to be Imputed to Great Britain or America. America was the author's answer. A few days later, the diarist picked up a copy of Richard Price's Observations on the Nature of Civil Liberty and the Justice and Policy of the War with America. Unjust was Richard Price's answer. Here's how Copley described the war with America when he first learned about the fighting in Lexington in April of 1775, news which took until July of 1775 to reach him in Parma in Italy. He says, "The flame of civil war is now broke out in America, and I have not the least doubt it will rage with a violence equal to what it has done in any other country in any time." A civil war, as my colleague David Armitage has recently and brilliantly explained, is in many ways cast as the opposite of a revolution, an expression of spasmodic violence with unpredictable and usually negative consequences, distinctly unprogressive, unrighteous, a slipping backwards into atavism and barbarism rather than a new beginning. And yet civil war is also the genus of which revolution, in the new sense that Copley did not share, was a particularly proud species. At the same time that his Boston contemporaries were actively calling a nation into being, signing a declaration centered on verbs like dissolve and assume and publish and pledge and, of course, declare, Copley was reveling in a kind of happenstance, casting himself, as in this quote from a letter written the next month, not as the agent of destiny, but as a recipient of it. Not as a declarer of independence, but a creature of interdependence, an enmeshment of calling and character and kin that had taken him from the edge of the British Empire to the center. And I think so striking in this last line, reveling in the fact that he now has no choice left to make. So I want to think about what it means to look at the world of the American Revolution and even the founding of the United States through Copley's eyes, and to see not a revolution in Arendt's terms and not independence in Jefferson's terms, but rather a quite different mixture of dependence and independence, choice and accident. Copley shows us this blend in particularly vivid ways because he was a painter whose acuteness of vision left a lasting material legacy, including many wonderful things here on the Harvard campus. But as the historian Kathleen Duval has recently argued in her towering book, Independence Lost, centered on the American Revolution in the Gulf Coast, being independent, and here I'm quoting Duval, being independent would have been unwelcome to most people in 18th century North America. Men and women depended on a web of economic, social, and political connections that provided stability and opportunity even as they limited complete freedom of action. Empires worked in part because they incorporated diverse and unequal populations into a system of beneficial, if also coercive, connections. For most, advantageous interdependence was a more logical goal, end quote. Copley's pursuits, sometimes deliberate, sometimes shambling, of interdependence, which was sometimes advantageous and sometimes disastrous, are my subject this afternoon. But I also want to think with you about how looking at this particular and in many ways peculiar life story changes the shape of the whole. So this story of interdependence is not the story we usually tell about Copley or indeed about Boston, where we use Copley to tell a particular story and where Copley spent his first 38 years. Boston began calling itself the cradle of American liberty as early as 1791. That's the first printed usage I've found of it. And by the American centennial in 1876, that slogan was everything but trademarked, not only part of the city's sense of itself, as it still is, but of its tourist economy, including the new Museum of Fine Arts, which opened in that centennial year, which opened on July 4th of 1876, facing an open plaza that came in 1882 to be called Copley Square. Beginning in that centennial generation, Copley's work came to play a large role in a national and civic narrative. We might say that Copley's Paul Revere, the inescapable Paul Revere, was the baby in the cradle of liberty. That was a laugh line. It's his most iconic work, arguably the second most famous face of revolutionary America after George Washington, whom Copley never painted, which I think was a missed opportunity for both of them. He painted this portrait of the silversmith in 1768, a year of renewed political upheaval in British America following a period of relative quiet. The painting is small. This is the size of which you could fit 10 in the family picture, but it looms large in a particular liberty narrative of the American founding, and has done that work publicly since it came into public hands in the 1930s. If you doubt that we place this in a liberty narrative, here's how the Museum of Fine Arts displayed Copley's Revere in 1951 between the flags of the United States and the flag of the Commonwealth. This is his Liberty Bowl, Revere's Liberty Bowl, also fashioned in 1768 in front of it. And let me just tell you, as a lapsed Catholic girl, this is an altar. Right? And there's a sort of chalice-like presentation of the Liberty Bowl. And American museology has changed so much since 1951. And the new Art of the Americas wing at the Museum of Fine Arts really is splendid. And yet we have hung on to some of the ways that Revere is working sacredly in a narrative of the American Revolution, which includes this quartet of Copleys receding back into the distance, Sam Adams, John Hancock perched over his account book as if in 1765 he's practicing his signature for the Declaration of Independence. 11 years later, Dr. Joseph Warren waiting to become the martyr of Bunker Hill, and Mercy Otis Warren waiting to become a generation hence the first historian of the American Revolution. The gallery is called Revolutionary Boston. My colleague Jill Lepore has called these the Patriot Super Friends. So a particular story of Boston and its role in the founding of a particular story of the nation with Copley pressed into its service, when in fact Copley grew up in a very different Boston with a very different set of connections and belongings. So this is a detail from a map that is reprinted throughout the 18th century. This is a 1769 printing. It's first printed in 1722. And the whole map performs for the harbor. East is the north of this map, just as 18th century Boston performed for the harbor, and as indeed every American seaport did. These were second-tier British seaports, not an incipient Acela corridor. Copley lived in his early years in one of these ramshackle houses on the north side of the Long Wharf. It's a very plebeian space where his mother sold tobacco on the first floor and family possessions and living space was in a sort of second floor lean-to. He was the child of immigrants, which was not unusual in the world of the 18th century Atlantic, which is a very mobile place, but is quite unusual in the world of New England, which was by then a very long-lived settler colonial population. His parents were both from Ireland in the second substantial wave of Irish immigration to Boston in the 1730s. His mother was sort of a Tennessee Williams character, a fallen gentry from County Clare, and his father, in the way of such tales, was a ne'er-do-well from Limerick. In this oceanic world, if we think about where all these ships were going, and this is a question that we can answer by looking at newspapers, which tracked ships coming in and ships going out, they were going to places like Halifax, Jamaica, and Barbados, which were the three most frequent trading partners of Boston, to England, especially to London and to Bristol, and more often to West Africa than to Philadelphia or New York. So if we're doing that Saul Steinberg cartoon, that famous cartoon of the view of the world from 9th Avenue, the view of the world from Copley's Boston was closer to Jamaica than it was to Philadelphia. There's a sort of famous historian's canard that at the time of the First Constitutional Convention, First Continental Congress, more of the participants in that Congress had been to London than had been to Philadelphia, which of course made sense in their world. London was the only capital city recognized by all of these disparate provinces, which in British North America at the time of Copley's birth numbered not 13, but 21, and after 1763 numbered 26. So that's the landscape of America for him, is 26 polities. There's no logical subgroup of 13 in the world of his childhood. And the place that they call home is London. London called home even into the post-revolutionary American Atlantic. Another reason to focus on the oceanic nature of Copley's world, besides connections and trade, is I think that oceans remind us of a certain kind of drift, of fatalism, of the bobbing cork of an individual on a sea of life. In Copley's case, a kind of Anglican providentialism that's emblematized in the "no choice left" quote that I showed you before, but also in print in this first sentence of a Loyalist narrative in 1782, in which our hero, Lieutenant James Moody, says, "The choice and plan, it would seem, have seldom much influence in determining either men's characters or their conditions. These are usually the result of circumstances utterly without our control." The importance of this sense of accidents and contingency to biography is true to the whole genre. I think one of the reasons it's worth looking at history at the level of individual life is it reminds us that while we as historians, as social scientists, traffic in patterns and choices, accidents more than plans make up the people who make up history. And this was a truism of Copley's life and of his American Revolution as well. So I'm going to sketch a couple of tiers of accident, starting with the personal. I've said that he was the child of Irish immigrants. He was also a child who was, for much of his early years, raised by a widowed mother without brothers or sisters. This is a very distinctive condition in the rabbit hutch of 18th century America, where, especially in the North, families of 8 or 10, 12 children are the norm. The last time I know his father was alive, Copley was 3 years old. His mother was as young as 30 and didn't remarry for a long time, which is itself interesting and unrecoverable to me. It's atypical of the time. So the two of them shifting together, this very young boy and this widowed trader woman on the Long Wharf for a long period of time. I think among the accidents of character it makes him a watchful person. It's a rough and dangerous space, the Long Wharf. Seamen and stevedores and the people who serviced them in all of the ways that they needed servicing. Another accident, I didn't want to say whores a second time in the same talk at Harvard, but here I've done it. Another biographical accident that winds up being very important, and you're wondering how Cotton Mather is going to enter this story, and here it is that when Copley's mother, Mary Singleton Copley, remarried in 1748 when Jack Copley, as she called him, was 10, it happened to be to a highly trained artisan from London named Peter Pelham, also an immigrant and also with Irish connections. There's no surviving image of Pelham, but this is the mezzotint engraving that he did of Cotton Mather soon after Pelham got to America. He came to America, he got Mather to sit to him. A London-trained portraitist was a good thing, and then Mather did the best thing Mather could have possibly done for Pelham's career, which was to die. And he marketed this mezzotint print in Boston, at which point mezzotint was new enough, which meant that Pelham's skills were distinctive enough that he had to explain in the newspapers what this form of engraving was. So he got a stepfather who happened to be an artisan really quite on the cutting edge. Another accident, both happy and sad, is that the couple began to have children right away. So Jack, at age 10, got a very beloved little brother, Henry, known as Harry, in this little candlelight portrait off on the other side of your screen. And there was a short-lived little girl named Helena Maria who died before her first birthday. What's interesting to me about Helena Maria is that is a very high church name for an Anglican on the eastern rim of the Atlantic. I don't know whether there's crypto-Catholicism in their background. And then the last biographical accident that matters for this part of my story today is that 3 years after this blended family came together, and probably after 3 years in which a 10-year-old would be put to work in his father's artisanal enterprise, Peter Pelham died. So that Copley has a male provider in his life, maybe for the first 3 years of his life, and then for a 3-year window in his early adolescence, leaving behind a vulnerable young family with a 12 to 13-year-old Copley as the male provider, and the rudiments of this very particular and peculiar trade. So an accident that meant that Copley had to get to work very early, and that the work he had to get to work in was the work of artisanship and art. This is one of the earliest surviving Copley canvases from 1754. It's at the Museum of Fine Arts. It's in store. They don't hang it. You can probably see why. I want to say just a couple of things about this picture before moving on to a different type of accidental shaping. So it's a very ambitious picture in a lot of ways for somebody who is trying out his hand. It's a copy of a European print, which is a copy of a European painting, and its mythological subject is Galatea riding the waves. Like Boston itself, it depicts an oceanic world. Several of Copley's earliest paintings are these reproductions of European seascapes. It's very large. It's 2 reveres. So from the perspective of a 16-year-old trying to fashion himself as an artist, that represents a significant investment in materials as well as an investment in time. And keep in mind that the canvas, the brushes, the pigments, the oils, the recipes, everything but the frame would have come imported from London. The other thing that I find kind of importantly poignant about this image is how faint provincial echoes of a very distant cosmopolitan world meant something. So that seeing the print and imagining the colors and knowing something of not only Ovid's Galatea, but that Handel had remade Galatea into the most popular piece of secular music in 18th century London. How all of that, in some game of telephone way, found its way into Copley's Boston. So 1754, at the age of 16, here's an artisan's child painting himself into the world of British Empire and trying to imagine it in color. I think it's metaphorically quite true to Copley's hunger and what you could and couldn't do in the Boston of his time. The other important and accidental context that he shared with an entire generation, and not just fatherless boys on the wharf in Boston, was that he lived in a world of war. And in this sense, the American Revolution wasn't so revolutionary after all, because European imperial wars played out in North America were statistically the norm of his life. He lived for 77 years. 45 of those years were spent in wartime, where England, France, and North America were all involved. The first of these 4 wars of Copley's life broke out the year after he was born. Though he couldn't have possibly known it, he was born at the end of the longest peace for a century. This is the Second 100 Years' War, as some historians call it. And significantly, I've said that 1754, 1753 are his first surviving works. It was a happy accident in ways for his career that he came to artistic adulthood and to the need for a manly competence, as people at his time would have put it, as the 7 Years' War was making Boston a provisioning hub of the northern frontier of this great global war. The 7 Years' War killed an awful lot of people, not just around North America and not just around the Atlantic, but around the globe. But it also made great fortunes, and it brought the empire to Boston in a way that had never happened before. The number of redcoats on the ground go from scores to hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands in a period of about 2 years. And as the empire collected in that provisioning hub, there were people who had fortunes to have their portraits painted, like John Hancock's Uncle Thomas. That's where his fortune originates, is in provisioning ships for the northern frontier of the 7 Years' War. And there were soldiers and other men attached to the British Army who wanted to have their portraits painted in the cloth of empire. So I put quite a lot of weight in my book on some of these quite formulaic early military paintings, which are not especially interesting art historically. They're kind of much of a muchness. And yet, in terms of building Copley's strategic world, showing these men in the scarlet fabric of empire and contributing to the gift economy, where a portrait went to Hancock to thank him for his generosity, were inordinately important to a young artist who wanted to break the frame of provincial Boston, which he called this frozen region he knew about today, right? The strategies these paintings tested, the networks they provided, the skills that they built, all became very important to Copley in the post-7 Years' War world. This is another one, still in private hands, of Colonel Jacob Fowle. This is painted at the very end of the 7 Years' War. The one I just showed you was painted near the beginning. So that these red-coated images are carrying him through the entirety of this war, and indeed a bit beyond. What I wanted to tell you about this picture is this is a very old-style uniform. It's an older man who has not served in the 7 Years' War, but served in the war before that. And yet the new war made you take out the uniform of the old war and show your connection to the lineage that looks backwards over the Hanoverian arc of time not forwards anticipating some American Revolution, which is literally unimaginable. The most important of Copley's redcoats over the course of his entire career, both historically and biographically, is this dramatic three-quarter length history portrait of General Thomas Gage, who was the commander of British forces in all of North America, and who came to Boston in the fall of 1768 to settle an occupying army into its winter quarters. Because that visit was so closely documented, we know almost exactly when Copley painted this picture, which was within months, if not within weeks, of the moment that he painted Paul Revere. So when we're thinking about his world, we have to think of those things going together. We also have to think of the fact that Copley, at this point, so 1768 in the Gage portrait and 1769 in this document, which shows all the attendees of the annual commemoration of the Stamp Act riots by the Sons of Liberty. So in this document, Copley is listed among the Sons of Liberty. This is Copley here, the Adams cousins up there, Hancock as usual first under the H's, and Revere over there. So in some social and political network, he is a soft liberty man, as well as the painter of the general of the occupying army. Some historians in the past have taken this as a particular deftness in Copley's character. I think it shows us that the sides and the social worlds were really still very enmeshed and not very far apart at all, because these men also sat down and drank with Gage's adjutants. The revolution is not, after all, yet coming. Copley continues painting redcoats in the wake of the Boston so-called massacre in 1770. This is Captain John Montresor, who's one of Gage's adjutants. Copley paints him in New York in 1771, following that military nexus from the 7 Years' War into the early stages of the imperial crisis, and still broadening out these networks of men in red cloaks. This is at Detroit Institute of Arts now, and it's a really striking painting. So a counterfactual question would be, without the 7 Years' War and the military and social and economic connections it forged, I don't know that Copley would have begun by late 1764 or early 1765 to ponder the question that would dog him for the next decade and return in some ways for the rest of his life, which was how would his work stand up to the competition at home, which is to say in London, and ought he to follow it there? This, of course, is the famous Boy with a Flying Squirrel, which hangs at the MFA in a kind of pride of place, though not so prideful as the much lesser Revere. Copley sent it to London in September of 1765 in the immediate wake of the Stamp Act riots, which he bemoaned, even though he was a liberty man. More contradiction. He was painting and planning it that entire year, if not longer, and building up a network of sea captains and military men and other conduits to get it from the Long Wharf to the annual spring exhibition of the Society of Artists of Great Britain, a society and exhibition program that was itself a kind of artistic nationalism catalyzed by the 7 Years' War. So I think we might see this too as a kind of military painting with Boy with a Flying Squirrel draped literally in the scarlet cloth of empire. So I painted Copley largely as a creature of drift, which was how he experienced himself and in many ways continued to be. But he did one very planful and absolutely critical thing in his life, which was to marry very well and very deliberately in the fall of 1769, about a year after painting Revere and Gage, and just a couple of months after that Sons of Liberty dinner. We know that he was tactical about marriage because he wrote about how hard it was to put it off, how hard it was to husband his energies for his craft and stay a bachelor to the advanced age of 28. He wound up staying a bachelor 3 years longer than that. So even though we never know, is somebody aware of the demographic average that is the average age of marriage, he was aware that he was getting a little long in the tooth. We know it was a love marriage, or at least it unfolds on paper like a love marriage being the new fashion of the day, would have been considered quite preposterous even 100 years before. But it was also a tactical marriage. Love and money went together, and maybe even still do. A huge climb for him socially and economically. When we teach the marriage plot as the common plot of 18th century fiction, I think we too often forget that for every woman who married down, there's a man who married up. And that man was Copley. So he married Susanna Farnham Clarke. You've already met her in Silk in the family portrait, and gained in her set of family connections an enormous amount of economic wherewithal and new interdependencies and dependencies, some of which he could imagine and some of which he couldn't. So a kind of independence. Copley gained the wherewithal to purchase land, which was the only way someone could think of themselves as independent in the 18th century. This is why there were traditionally property qualifications required to be able to cast a vote. Only if you held real property did you have the capacity to have an independent opinion politically. So this is a detail taken from here on this map so that you can see that Copley's holdings in downtown Boston were large enough to be labeled as a map feature, as Copley's Hill. He put together about 14 contiguous acres of downtown Boston, going from, in the present, just next to the Bullfinch gold-domed State House all the way to Charles Street, and then going north all the way back to what was then the riverfront. So an enormous gentleman farm, which he describes at great length in a series of letters when he is having it renovated in 1770, 1771. He calls it Mount Pleasant. He cultivates potatoes. He does the whole gentleman farming thing. He also gained from his marriage children. Born at very regular intervals, the kind of regular intervals that Suki could only have because she was a fancy enough lady that she was employing a wet nurse, which we know from his letters that she was. The first daughter, Betsy, is born almost exactly 9 months after the marriage, but not one day sooner. And a young John Jr., who they called Jackie, about 18 months after that, and a daughter, Mary, called Polly, about 18 months after that. In fact, one of the reasons that Copley wound up still here in the fateful fall of 1773 is because Suki was pregnant again. Copley also became a slaveholder upon his marriage. Another kind of interdependence, that his growing liberty and capacity to exercise independent judgment put him into the rank of Boston's slaveholding classes, which were not as small as the Cradle of Liberty likes to suggest. This was an irony, this combination of slavery and liberty, that was much remarked upon by anti-revolutionary forces at the time, most famously Samuel Johnson in 1775, writing how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes. There were at least 3 bondspeople in Copley's retinue at Mount Pleasant in the immediate wake of his wedding. A boy called Snap, who was probably from the Caribbean, where Suki's father had business. A girl called Lucy, whom Copley sold in 1771 into the Pepperell family, whose new mistress was therefore the daughter of Isaac Royal, so he joins the Harvard slavery story that way. And an older boy or young man named Cato, in that classicizing way of naming slaves in the 18th century, who we know about because he married in Boston in the post-revolutionary period, able to take his independence in a way that he couldn't beforehand, and left a record that way. We don't know who this man is, who Copley painted in 1778, by which point he was in London. It's an oil sketch, a study picture for the figure at the apex of Watson and the Shark. It stayed in the family, this oil sketch, into the 1860s, was known in the catalog that sold the family pictures in 1862 as the head of a favorite Negro. So it is a familiar of the family. It's also a very familiar portrait, which is one of the things that the showing of teeth means. I don't know whether Copley had black servants in his retinue in London. They would likely not have been enslaved after the ambiguity that the Somerset decision of 1772 cast on slavery in Britain. However, and I'll come back to this when I close my circle in a little bit, slavery stayed important in Copley's story from cradle to grave. Copley's marriage also provoked him to take, for the first time, a trip abroad in the summer of 1771, which is what he called it when he went to New York. So London is home, and New York is abroad. And among the 36 paintings he turned out there in a mere 6 months, and Copley's known for his slowness, by the way, so this is frantic, is this spectacular likeness of Colonel Gage's wife, Margaret Kemble Gage, which Copley called the greatest female portrait of his life, and which certainly deserves that title, the greatest female portrait of his life to date, which was, it was 1772 when he said this. It's the tiny, tiny Timken Museum in San Diego. It is worth the trip. But if Copley gained strategically love and land and slaves and travel, he also gained accidentally a very close connection to tea. Tea was one of the commodities that Copley's father-in-law had made his fortune trafficking in. And in 1773, when Britain passed the Tea Act, making it possible to sell East India Company tea directly in the colonies through consignees for the first time at prices low enough to compete with smugglers, Copley's father-in-law felt that he was very lucky in getting one of the licenses to sell it in Boston. And it turned out, of course, not to be so lucky after all. So as the tea ships approached Boston, mobs set upon Copley's father-in-law's house on School Street, nearly destroying it. And even before the dumping of the tea, Copley's male kin were holed up in the British fortress at Castle Island for their own safety, threatened daily in the newspapers with tar and feathering and worse. And when the tea was dumped into Boston Harbor on December 16th of 1773, a plurality of those 342 tea chests belonged to Richard Clark, or belonged to the East India Company in consignment to Richard Clark. Copley's kin became persona non grata after that moment, and it turned out in the wake of the Tea Party that his marriage was the most important decision in his life in a very different way than he had anticipated, which is that he married his politics and ultimately his citizenship. For all of these reasons, family and war and calling and empire, and with only a little smattering of ideology, Copley's revolution led him home to the place where the family portrait sat on the easel in the spring of 1776, while many of his former Boston neighbors, including some men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, whom he had painted and then grown utterly to despise, had begun drafting a document declaring the independence of a nation and a notion of America that Copley would never see and never share. Lived and read about and seen from London, Copley's American Revolution was Britain's American War, a no choices left war, and soon a losing war. It's one of the great ironies of Copley's career that the war with America remained his context and his subject for much of the rest of his life. At first, in the 1770s and early 1780s, it was a kind of calling card, and then it was a millstone for a formerly American artist now at the center of the London establishment. Much of Copley's art in London was the art of winning by losing, where he was on the one hand able to paint as he could not possibly have done in British North America. The pictures got large and busy and complex, public art with different kinds of public patronage. But the dilemma of painting public art in London in the 1770s and 1780s was how to paint the irresistible subject of the day when Britain was losing. And this became Copley's niche. The American War, however much he and his family had tried to escape it, was his great and defining subject, his claim to academic bona fides in the higher reaches of British art and to public attention. The American War is the subject, to one degree and another, of all of his great London history pictures, including Watson and the Shark, the death of the Earl of Chatham, and the enormous and very belated siege and relief of Gibraltar, which I'll show you just in a flicker in a moment. And I'm happy to talk about any of those in the Q&A, but I want to talk in a little bit of depth about just one, the third, and I think the greatest of Copley's American War paintings, which celebrates a battle and even a theater of the American Revolution that you have likely never considered. So this is a painting called The Death of Major Pearson. It celebrates an event that happened in January of 1781, and it's displayed publicly in 1784. It's the Battle of Jersey, not New Jersey, but the Isle of Jersey. It featured no North American combatants, which was important to Copley's war. The Americans were not necessarily villains, though the British are heroes. In fact, it featured no official combatants at all. It's a kind of unofficial skirmish by a rump garrison of French legionnaires who leave Brittany and go raiding on the Isle of Jersey, resulting in an inglorious 15-minute-long battle, after which the governor of the island is court-martialed for his dereliction in allowing it to happen in the first place. A gallant young major died in it, whom nobody had ever heard of. This fellow in the middle, Francis Pearson, dying so beautifully in this image of martial sacrifice and Christian heroism. Copley painted it over 2 years, and it was exhibited after the Peace of Paris, which created the United States and ratified that his America, that seamless oceanic world of 26 colonies, was gone for good. In one of the most striking passages in the painting, Copley celebrates what he and others of his day called not just liberty, but British liberty or English liberty. Avenging Pearson's death is a servant of African descent, shown in a dramatic blue, not uniform, but servant's livery, a sort of military-style livery. I've traced him from the documentary record and found that this man is one of two people in real life, IRL, as my kids say. Someone who was born enslaved in the Carolinas and fled behind British lines to work for the British in the North American Continental Theater, and then followed his officer to other places on the British front lines, including this odd eastern front in the middle of Jersey. He wound up in London as a hairdresser, a skilled trade that would have been all but inconceivable for him as an enslaved man in the southern parts of the United States. I think one of the ways that Copley shows in several of these American war paintings that Britain is winning the war for liberty even as it's losing the war for its rebel colonies. The other striking passage in the painting is the presence of women and children in a battle scene, which is really quite anomalous in the genre of battle painting. This little group of non-combatants fleeing in terror at lower right is in fact Copley's family, his wife, his son, and his baby daughter, all sort of emblematic exiles, and their maidservant over here. Emblematic exiles in something of the way that they were in life. So I'll close my circle by talking about the question of how much he sees and doesn't see about the future, and how much we see and don't see about the future. In that same letter from August of 1775, where he's saying how relieved he is that he has no choice left, he comments about how short a way we penetrate into the secrets of futurity. He's pretentious. He talks, and it's not just 18th century, he's a sort of pretentious, ambitious fellow. And I think one of the things that a close view of the world of revolution through ambivalent men like Copley reminds us of is that it is very different to be looking at history forward than looking at it backward. This is especially true of the world of the American Revolution, which has come to take on, in retrospect, within the United States, an aura of destiny that also gives it a kind of tidiness and linearity, a mythic founding. Like the rest of us, Copley saw into the future both well and poorly. For example, at the time he wrote this letter in the summer after Lexington, he was certain that when the bleeding stopped, quote, the Americans will be a free, independent people. He did not mean this as a compliment, but nobody at the time thought that America would win, certainly not George Washington. Yet, as he went on to explain, the strife would not end with independence. The country, he said, would be torn in pieces twice. First, by the quarrel with Great Britain till it is a distinct government, and then with civil discord till time has settled it into some permanent form. Whether that form would be, he said, free or despotic was beyond the reach of human wisdom to decide, and I think we're actually still waiting. Pictorially, Copley grasped the future poorly. As I've said, he hung on to the American war much too long, in part because he painted much too slowly and deliberately. So this is that last great American war picture, The Siege and Relief of Gibraltar. It's the largest picture he ever painted, 18 by 25 feet. It hangs in Guildhall in London right now. It was painted for Guildhall. It was so much too big that they had to cut it down to fit in its purpose-built gallery. It took him so long to paint it that it was not exhibited until almost 10 years after the siege was broken, by which point all of the eyes of England had moved on to the next imperial war, to painting Nelson and thinking about Napoleon, which Copley missed. It is an accident of his life that he missed both Nelson and Washington, who were the great subjects of either side of their Atlantic for the day, and hung on to what for Britons was a mercifully fading memory of the loss of Americans and his own losses too. But I think the realm in which he was most deliberate and planful and successful about futurity was the realm of family. He said during his grand tour that launching his family into the great world with reputation was what he was doing it for, and that he did very well. So this is his son, the little fleeing boy at the edge of the death of Major Pearson, all grown up as Lord Lyndhurst, Baron, and Lord High Chancellor, peer of the new creation, painted here as the aristocrat and man of state he had become by the 1830s. Copley's son visited the young United States in 1796 to see if it was safe for the women and children. He thought briefly about building a Western estate there with hundreds of acres for his parents and their dotage, and then decided, after all, it was dicey. He wrote, if you want to be cured of your Jacobinism, come to Philadelphia. Copley's daughter, Betsy, also succeeded in some ways more grandly and in others more darkly. She, too, was married late and tactically at the ripe age of 30, back to America, not Copley's America, and back to Boston. Like her father, she also married into slavery, a slaving fortune in the Demerara sugar trade with the planter Gardner Green. They lived on Beacon Hill in grand style. Their money, Green's slaving wealth, is what funded the rise of the son into the ranks of lawyerdom and then the peerage, and also what saved the Copleys from penury in his declining years. Betsy and her husband, Gardner Green, had a large staff of servants, including several free African Americans and at least one enslaved named Harry, who was also Gardner Green's son. When Harry Green died, when Gardner Green died in 1832, his will manumitted Harry, which I think means that Harry Green was one of the last, if not the last, enslaved man in Boston, living about 2 blocks down from where The Liberator was published. So slavery at the core of Copley's ability to self-make and self-sustain from first to last. Betsy Copley, Gardner Green's wife, lived for decades after her husband passed. Here she is in a studio portrait taken in Boston in 1862. I love the parrot. And this matters in a variety of ways because she saved the archive that wound up enabling me to tell this story. It's at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And also because she made sure to get the pictures. And it is her collecting efforts that brought Boy with a Flying Squirrel and The Ascension, the Izzards, Watson and the Shark, and the family picture to the United States, which we might call a repatriation, but they would call an expatriation. The family portrait hangs today in the West Wing of the National Gallery, set very appropriately alongside the works of Joshua Reynolds, Thomas Gainsborough, and others of Copley's peers who, like him, were British artists from cradle to grave. Thank you.
My name is Arthur Grove. I'm one of a number of people in your audience who are museum guides at the Museum of Fine Arts. I'm very pleased to have read your book, very pleased to hear you speak. You combined the opportunity to have both an educational point of view and a very entertaining way of presenting your material. I wanted to ask one question that I was unaware of until I read your book, and that is the dispute between Paul Revere and his half-brother, Harry or Henry Pelham, which when you go in to see Paul Revere and look to the right, you can appreciate the fact that these two people who should have been good friends were not such good friends.
Yeah, thank you for that. They're, you know, Revere and his family and Copley and his family are part of the same world of men who work with their hands and their heads. We know that Revere borrows some of the specialized press implements that allows him to run off his engravings from the Pelham family, probably a way that Mary Pelham monetized some of her husband's legacy by lending it to Revere. We also know that Revere was a thief. Just in the totally expected way that in a world before copyright, the way that you took images was to borrow bits and pieces. Revere couldn't draw worth a dime, but he knew well what to copy. And when the Boston so-called massacre occurred in March of 1770, Revere, working closely with the firebrand Boston printers Benjamin Eads and Moses Gill, knew that an image to make that incendiary event come alive for readers was very important. And it so happened that Harry Pelham had drawn one and was rushing his own engraving into print. Revere had better channels, and Revere got the engraving into print first. And Pelham wrote him just an excoriating letter saying, how could you? You know, Pelham had staked a fortune on being able to produce this thing and earn out, and Revere took it and used his better networks and some slightly better details. You know, Revere changes the name of the custom house to Butcher's Hall. So that very iconic image of a world coming apart, Revere's massacre image, which until George Washington's portrait begins to circulate, is the most famous image of the revolutionary project in the world, is stolen from Copley's half-brother. I think it's incontrovertible. And Harry Pelham was an immoderate guy. He was a hothead, and he hated Revere after that. And I don't know what Copley thought of Revere, but I think he would have picked up his half-brother's side of this feud. He wrote and said, "Give me the pieces of the press back."
You know, in 1770, Harry Pelham was only 21 years old. Paul Revere was 36 years old. So there's a great deal of difference. Harry Pelham was trying to start his career. Paul Revere was already an established,
not very nice,
successful man.
It's
but
not very nice.
my question that I wanted to ask was, I have your quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But Harry Pelham's letter to Paul Revere, and I'm just going to read the last line from your book. I will leave you to reflect upon and consider of one of the most dishonorable actions you could well be guilty of. Now, the question is, did Revere respond to that criticism?
It's hard for me to believe that Pelham saved letters. That's how I've got so much that's so good to work with in textual form. I can't imagine that Pelham wouldn't have saved and indeed publicized Revere's response. So my guess is that Revere did not respond, but the response has not survived.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm Sasha Tipper. I am a professor emeritus from Nichols College in English. I have a few trivial questions to ask. First of all, I'm interested in wives and mothers, and you didn't. I'm also interested in I wonder whether his mother, you talked about his father's, the two fathers' influence. Did the mother have any influence upon him at all? Was he a spoiled child, or was it the poverty that put an end to that? And also, you didn't talk much about the wife, but why was she willing to go to London with her husband, for instance?
Thank you. Some of my best friends are wives and mothers, and they both of those women mattered tremendously to this story. So I think his mother brought everything of culture that he would have known to his world until Peter Pelham joined their household when Copley was 10. She came from a beautiful house in County Clare. It was on sale at the time of my writing my book for 1.3 million euros in a kind of Gothicized version. She had the education of a daughter of the landed gentry. We know she has a very fine lady's hand. She has a much better education than her son does. When her first husband's estate was probated, It's an estate worth about 97 pounds, which would be on the lower end of accumulated property in the colonies, and yet in it is a looking glass and a suite of 6 framed prints and pictures. So I think there is a hunger for culture that must come from her in a way that I can't see in his early life, but I can see her shaping hand in his later life. He was also, and forgive me for saying something so entirely recherché, he was an incredible mama's boy. You know, he was, when he goes to London, he takes the grand tour, launches from London, and travels with another really sort of third-tier British painter named George Carter. And George Carter writes this picaresque narrative of their travels in which he says about Copley, he has been too long the hero of each little tale. I take that to be, first of all, it's a kind of cliche, right? The country bumpkin in the Cosmopolis. It's also a story about Boston, a pond small enough that Copley was the most talented person within 3,000 miles. But I think it's also a family story, you know, making much of that he took from his household into his career, and Carter goes into, you know, there's never a plate is passed that he doesn't take the biggest chicken leg first when, you know, or take 3 before everybody else has 1, that he sighs and swoons over the bedding, that he, you know, I think he is much doted on, and I think that is a shaping influence of his character. You know, in many ways, the question of the wife, you know, I think there's an interesting tension between the ways that her identity is covered by his in the way that everything about 18th century history would lead us to expect, right? The custom and law of coverture is she loses even her name, her ability to own property. But in other ways, he is covered by her. It's her political identity. It's the shaping hand of her kin network that takes him to London and keeps him there. You know, she goes to London because the going has gotten so hot that he really can't come back. By the time she goes to London, Boston is under siege by the Patriot forces, the new Continental Army. They are some of the last loyalists out. He is not an exile, but she is an exile, and that politically comes from her father. The desire to stay in London is his. So she goes there in flight, not without his connivance, and she stays there because it remains his home. Her kin all come to London as loyalists during the war, and all return and take up their lives and fortunes in the new United States, which, as my colleague Maya Jasanoff has written about, is one of the things that loyalists did. Some of them resumed, and Copley chose not to, and she was governed by that choice. So it's an excellent question.
Hi, I'm Sarah Friedman, and I had a question about, you mentioned that in 1831 that Henry was manumitted.
1832, yeah.
1832. I was wondering if you had, because that kind of surprised me.
Sure does, yeah.
And because we know at least the 1790 census, there are no slaves.
And never again.
Right. So were you able to find, so in the 1820 census, 1830 census, under that household, was he listed? Was there anything else that corroborated this other than the word manumitted, or?
So I think that this is a lacunae in our understanding of slavery in the North, where, as you know, slavery is established by custom and legal slavery is abolished by custom and legal precedent in Massachusetts in 1783 with the freedom suit that Quock Walker brings. And from 1790 forward, there is never again an enslaved person censused as enslaved. And yet manumissions continue. I think, you know, if I had Gardner Green here, Gardner Green would say, and Harry is interviewed in various Boston publications when when Gardner Green dies as his faithful man. Harry, it's not said that it's his son, but it's very clear. He lives as if a free man. And I think what this means is when the census taker comes to your door, you say, oh, it's a free man. He's living as if a free man. There is a bequest that Gardner Green makes to his mulatto, Harry, in the will, to establish him in a house of his own, which is 10 feet by 10 feet, a tenement worth $400. Gardner Green's household is worth $1.5 million in 1832. So I think the gray area between bondage and freedom lasts longer, is grayer, than our conventional stories of the end of slavery in Boston allow. He's very late. He's after gradual abolition has ended slavery in most of the North, even for the longest lived after this date, and you have to reach 25. I just think we would have to look places other than the census records to find it out.
So please join me in giving a round of applause to Jane for her wonderful